Introductory biology will review basic plant and animal physiology from an evolutionary perspective. As part of presenting you the material from this perspective, we will be showing you a variety of phylogenetic trees. And since most students can use an introduction on interpreting phylogenetic trees, that's where we'll start. This figure depicts a species that is split into two, which are species A and B in the figure. Then, species B splits again into a third species, C. We are left with three overall species. The phylogenetic tree on the right reflects this pattern of ancestry. The process of speciation is depicted in the tree, where branches represent diverging species. Each split in the tree represents when two lineages become reproductively isolated. At each split, there is a node which represents the common ancestor of both lineages. As species proliferate, their evolutionary relationships to one another unfold in a tree-like pattern, with present-day species as the tips of branches and their last common ancestors at nodes from which they branched off. A phylogenetic tree can be oriented vertically or horizontally. On the previous slide, the orientation was vertical. In this case, the orientation is horizontal. The tips of the branches on the right represent the most recent time in the tree, and when you walk back from the tips, you're moving back in time. As such, phylogenetic trees are graphical hypotheses about evolutionary relationships. The branching order found in a phylogenetic tree hypothesizes the evolutionary relationship within a group. For example, this tree proposes that the closest living relatives of birds are crocodiles and alligators. They are joined by a recent common ancestor at node A. If we were to look at a larger grouping, we could see that crocodiles and alligators and birds are relatives of turtles, shown by a common ancestor at node B. Stepping out even further, we could take a look at the relationship for tetrapods as an entire group. Here, we can see that the most recent relative of tetrapods are lungfish based on their most recent common ancestor shown at node C. Two groups are considered to be each other's closest living relatives if they share a common ancestor not shared by any other group. Two groups that are each other's closest relatives are called sister groups, and the closeness of the relationship is determined by looking to see how recently two groups share a common ancestor. In the example shown here, we can see that crocodiles and alligators are a sister group with birds. The outside group is represented by turtles. When interpreting a phylogenetic tree, it's important to understand that a node can be rotated without changing the evolutionary relationships of the group. We can see this by rotating the first phylogenetic tree shown here in a variety of ways. Each of the subsequent three trees look different to you at first glance, but when you examine the branching pattern, you'll see that they have identical patterns of ancestry. When reading phylogenetic trees, you'll hear some terms when discussing those evolutionary relationships that are shown. So let's define them for you here. A monophyletic group, shown in blue and also called a clade, includes a common ancestor and all of its descendants. Here, we can see that if we look at the group of amphibians, there is only one cut necessary to isolate that group from the remainder of the phylogenetic tree. Another group type is called a paraphyletic group, here shown in green. This includes a common ancestor in some, but not all of the descendants. Here we could see that the descendants of birds have been removed from the grouping under this common ancestor, so we have a paraphyletic group that includes the reptiles but excludes birds. A polyphyletic group, shown in red, does not include a common ancestor. Polyphyletic groups also require multiple cuts to be removed from the rest of the tree. The example we have here are birds and bats, which can be classified as flying tetrapods or four-limbed organisms, but do not share a recent common ancestor. It's important to note that only monophyletic groups reflect evolutionary relationships because only they include all the descendants of a common ancestor. This means that monophyletic groups alone show the evolutionary path a given group has taken since its origin. The goal of classification systems is to reflect evolutionary relationships. Each unit of classification should represent a monophyletic group. This slide shows an idealized representation of how classification and phylogeny should come together. Here, starting on the left, we can see that organisms are classified according to phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Note that unlike a typical phylogenetic tree, time is not a component of this taxonomic classification. What we can see, though, is this same grouping concept that applies to phylogenetic trees. Here, we see that closely related species are grouped into a genus. Closely related genera, the plural of genus, belong to a larger branch of the tree classified as a family. Closely related families form an order, orders form a class, classes form a phylum, and, unseen on this slide, multiple phyla form a kingdom. Today's biologists also refer to the three largest limbs of the entire tree of life as domains. These are above the kingdom level, and the three commonly accepted domains are eukarya, bacteria, and archaea.